Hello and welcome to the third and final video in the tutorial video series for the Custom Story Creator. This video is going to cover how to implement quests and opportunities for characters. We're going to go over how dialogue works. We're going to take a look at cutscenes and how to trigger them, as well as after cutscene event triggers. Then we're going to go ahead and wrap up with importing and exporting your story files so that you can do playtesting in House Party. Let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and jump into opportunities, which are, they're called opportunities, but that's used interchangeably with quests in the CSC. So come to your character script, and then we'll come over here to character quests, which is the opportunities that you have in the game with Amy, or whatever character you're looking at. So this right here has the quest name. You don't really need to worry about the quest ID. Obtain on game start, kind of makes sense. Display progress to player, kind of makes sense. And then completion value. This determines how many steps in the quest there are. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to go ahead and add a new quest, because I don't want to delete what I have up here. We'll go ahead and, quest name. So you can see right now completion value is 1, which means you have the obtained description, which this is step 1 right here, the failed description, which is right here, and the completed description right here. So this is the basic, very basic structure of what an opportunity looks like in House Party. So you have your quest name. When you're given the quest, so the quest is enabled, this step 1 is the text that the player sees in the opportunity log. Then if the player fails that, it's a failed description here, and if they complete the quest, it's right here. And now you can add multiple steps here, so if you do 2, it'll go ahead and add another step. It says step 1, but this is basically the obtained description is your step 1, and step 1 here is step 2. You can go 4, 5, whatever you want. And each one of these will increment through the story if you have a quest increment option. One thing to note, which is the reason that I was messing with it down here instead of up here, is if you have something like this is step 4/5, and then you come up here to completion value and you're like, oh, I want to remove a step here to streamline this a little bit, and you go to 4, it's going to remove that description, and if you add it back, it's going to be blank again. So kind of important to pay attention to that so you don't accidentally delete some of your work up here. So the character quest page, or opportunities as we usually call them in the CSC and in House Party, is primarily focused on the different steps of your storyline. So this example storyline is on the tutorial story. It's just called Nuggets of Destiny, and the basic gist of it is find some chicken nuggets and then bring them to Derek. So we have this quest start when you're talking to Amy, and then you go ahead and bring the nuggets to Derek and hand them to him, and then you return to Amy. And when you return to Amy, then the opportunity is successful. We'll go ahead and show you step by step how this works, just so you can follow along and learn how opportunities can happen in the game. So for Amy, we'll go to scripted dialogue. And I have a dialogue here that says, show me how an opportunity works. We'll go ahead and explain all of these options here in the next section, because there's a lot of in-depth stuff that you can take a look at with dialogue. But just to show you how this opportunity is set up, we'll go to dialogue 5. And right here, we have quest, Nuggets of Destiny, start. So when you go to quest, which is opportunities, like I said, they're used interchangeably. All of the quests available in the game are going to be listed right here. So we just have it set to start, but you can also increment, complete, or fail that opportunity at any point in time. So right now we have start. We want the player to go get the chicken nuggets, which we don't need to track any of that. Well, one thing to note real quick is we have this set on dialogue start. So when the player gets to this dialogue with Amy, this quest is going to start. It'll pop up in the corner of the screen for the player. Then they can open their opportunity log, and this is what it's going to say right here. So on obtained description. Step 1, this is the very first thing they're going to see when they open their opportunity log. It's a good idea to tell the player what to do and what the next step of the quest is. So the player is going to go get the chicken nuggets, and then go to Derek. We're going to go to item interactions. We have this already set up because it's a tutorial. The criteria we have here is checking to see, is this quest in progress, which we know that it is, and has dialogue 5 for Derek been shown. So the reason we're checking for this is we know for a fact that when the player talks to Amy, they get this quest. And the next step of the quest involves giving them to Derek, which would show this dialogue, which is why we're able to check to see if this dialogue was shown. Because now when we hand him the chicken nuggets, these two pass, then it's going to remove the chicken nuggets from the inventory, and it's going to trigger dialogue 5. So if, hypothetically, for some reason the player ends up with the chicken nuggets again at any point in time, they can't give the chicken nuggets back to Derek because this dialogue has already been shown. But we're going to go ahead and look now at the dialogue Derek 5, because this is what triggers when you hand him the chicken nuggets. Go to scripted dialogue, and 5. And he does explain a little bit here of what I'm talking about, but you can play through that in the storyline if you want to. But you can see here, dialogue start, quest, increment. So what increment does is this moves this quest one step further down the line. So quest, increment, we will come back to Amy, we'll look at the quests, and you can see increment means it's going to move down one more step, and it's going to be right here now. So if you increment the quest one more time, it's going to hit completion, and it's going to automatically complete. But I usually track it step by step when I'm doing the original story, because I don't like to just assume it's going to increment when I want it to. So I only increment when I know for a fact that there's still more quests to go. So in this case, I'm incrementing the quest to say, okay, we've given them to Derek, now we need to return to Amy and complete the quest. So we do that by going back to Amy, and we have a new dialogue response available, which has the criteria, was dialogue 5 shown? We know that dialogue 5 was shown because we just had Derek, with the item interaction, trigger dialogue 5. So it's going to come down here, and then Amy is going to have this response, which is dialogue 6, which completes the quest. And then if you come to Amy quests, it'll go whoop, right down here to opportunity successful. Now, if for some reason the player fails, which in the original story we have opportunities fail if you hit an NPC, or they overhear something, or you do something incorrect in the quest, then you can just fail that opportunity. Quest, fail, and then it's just going to fail out of that quest. One thing to note is that for opportunities, you cannot check which stage of the opportunity you're at without having some way to track it, like with a value. So what that means is, if you come to your character quest here, there's no way to add a criteria to something to say, is this quest on step 2? So that's why when I come to Derek on item interactions, I'm checking for, is the quest in progress, and is this dialogue not shown? Because the only way to check a quest is if you're checking if it's not obtained, if it's in progress, complete, failed, or missed. So what that means is we can check to see if this quest is in progress, but we can't check where that is. So we need these other criteria. In this case, I'm checking for a dialogue, which is how you control where the player is at in the narrative. Now, sometimes you'll have an opportunity when you're designing your custom story where you're going to want to know step by step where's the player at, because you're going to need to know there's too many NPCs to keep track of, you need to keep track of whose dialogue is firing, and you don't want to have to think about, okay, which dialogue is being shown, whatever. In that case, what I would recommend doing is coming to whichever character has that quest, and then just making a value. And you can just name it whatever the opportunity is, add the value, And now you can keep track of this manually. So you can set this to 0, and then when the player is given the quest, you can just go ahead and go to Events, Modify Value, select the character that has that value on them, which is Amy. Select that, and you can equals or add. We can just say add 1, and now we know Nuggets of Destiny is going to be equal to 1. So that allows us to know exactly which step of the quest we're on. And then you can increment this or adjust it wherever you're at in the opportunity. And I use those quite a bit in the original story, like I said, when there's too much going on for me to keep track of all of the different dialogue and all the different possibilities for what the player could be doing, because we have a lot of branching storylines. And so sometimes the player might skip ahead of a quest, or they might, have 2 different ways of tackling something. And in order to keep track of that, I use a value like this just to know, okay, I can just check for this value, and I know whatever this value returns is going to tell me exactly where the player is at in this storyline. And that about covers our opportunities. One last thing that I'd like to point out is if you're trying to do a search for opportunities, so let's say you're in your story script here, and then you come down to search, and you want to come to game event type, quest, search. This will pull up all of the storylines in the game. But if you try to look for a specific character, so for example you're trying to go Amy, and then you try and search, nothing's going to appear. And the reason that is because even though these quests are assigned to the individual characters, so if you come to Amy and you look at the quests, okay, we have a quest here, but then you go to Derek and he doesn't have any quests yet. The way that the CSC and the engine looks at it is all of those quests are basically compiled together on the back end. So when you're searching through the game, you can't go Amy quest and look for her quests. You have to set character to anybody. And then you can also get more specific by going to advanced options. And then doing sorry, I lost my train of thought on that. You don't have to worry about that. But if you just go to anybody and then quest, you can go ahead and see what they're at. And this is also a cool thing that we can do here if we reset this. You can also go to the character and then come down to filter values, select the quest value if you're using a value to keep track of that quest. I removed when we were incrementing it, but then you could do a search and then you could see exactly where this value is being modified, and you can track the quest that way as well. So that covers opportunities. You can also look at the original story for more inspiration for how we set these up. Always a good idea to come in here. So you can take a look at Amy, for example. She has 2 of them. You can see some of these are kind of basic, like this one. Sometimes they're just like a simple hollow one, is the best way to put it. And then you have more advanced ones, like the scavenger hunt for Amy is obviously a very, very involved one that has a lot of different steps. So it might be a good idea if you wanted to follow along with that and see how we set up and increment quests in the original story. Okay, so one of the last things that we need to look at in the CSC is the actual dialogue system that we use for our characters. So come on over to our character script for Amy, and we'll go ahead and go to scripted dialogue. And this automatically defaults to dialogue 0, which dialogue 0 is considered the default dialogue for all of the NPC characters. So what that means is this dialogue box right here at the top is the dialogue that the player is going to get when they talk to Amy initially. This is like the default. You talk to Amy, this is what pops up. You can also have alternate dialogues down here. So for example, you could put something here that says like, good job completing that quest. Add criteria. We'll just check to see, is this complete? If this happens right here, when the player talks to Amy, it's going to check the criteria for all of the alternate text, and if one of these passes, it's going to go ahead and override this initial dialogue. So with the way that this is set up, when the player completes this quest here, this dialogue is always going to pop up when the player talks to Amy. Now you can also add something in here called a coin flip, which basically just means there's a chance that this is going to fire. So we could remove this hypothetically, and there's a chance that this is going to fire. I believe it's 50-50. I'm not 100% sure on what the coin flip is. I think it is though. So it's going to say this one's going to fire or this one's going to fire. That's good if you want to have some dialogue just to kind of mix things up and say, like, you know, this is an alternate dialogue. So now when you talk to Amy, there's a chance that one of these two is going to fire. And that just allows you to add a little bit more variety into the initial dialogue. But we'll go ahead and remove all this. And then we're going to go ahead and work our way down here while I explain what all of this is. And then we can start diving into how dialogue chains together. So working our way down here further, you have events on dialogue start and events on dialogue close. These are primarily used for overriding this initial dialogue depending on where you are at in the story. So let me give you an example from the original story. We come to Amy. This is 0, her initial dialogue. You can see that we have alternate text here. Then we have perform these events on dialogue start, and we trigger all of these different dialogue. So these are all contextual dialogue depending on what's happening in the storyline. So let me find a good one here. Here we go. So this checks a value for Amy that says attending the Doja Cat show equals 1. So if Amy is attending the Doja Cat show, this dialogue is going to trigger, which is just her shouting something about the Doja Cat concert. This is useful because we wanted to lock Amy down during the Doja Cat show, and we didn't want her initial dialogue to just be like, hello again, when there's a Doja Cat concert going on. So when the player first talks to Amy, or whatever NPC character it is, it's going to go through and check all of this criteria, and it's going to fire the first one of these that it finds. That's also important because if you have a lot of criteria down here that it passes, it's only going to fire the first one that matches. So in this case, it'll fire 163. And we use those in the original story for after you wrap up opportunity quest lines, or, you know, you need to lock down an NPC character and you just want them to say the same thing over and over again without allowing all of their base game responses and everything like that. So that's pretty useful to do. We also have, on characters like Derek, we have quest that starts. So when you first start the game and you talk to Derek, this is a quest that basically says, hey, go meet everybody at the party. This quest automatically starts if the player is male and has not started that quest. So you can pretty much do whatever you want here in Dialogue Start, but those are probably the two use cases that we've used the most, which is starting opportunities and triggering other dialogue to override the initial dialogue. And then we'll go ahead and go back to our tutorial story here on Amy. Now, we have things in the CSC dialogue which are called responses, global responses, and then goodbye responses. So those are three separate things, and it's important to know how each one of those works so you can get the most out of this system. I'm going to go ahead and collapse all this real quick so we can just streamline what this looks like. So right now you have responses, which these responses are tied specifically to this dialogue, which is dialogue 0. If you click this drop down, we have all these other dialogues available. Dialogue 0 responses are these. So that means when you talk to Amy, you get this dialogue that appears, and then these responses, depending on the criteria beneath them, are going to appear as options for the player to select. Now we can go ahead and take one of these, let's say this one, and we can move it to global responses. So this is a separate category that we have. Oh, we need to click this checkbox up here that says Show Global Responses. And a global response will also appear as a response to this dialog. But any of these other dialogues that Amy has, if we have show global responses selected, it's going to show responses that are specific to this dialog. So on this one you can see dialog 1, this is the dialog text, this is the dialog response. Now global responses will also appear. So this is if you're having a conversation with an NPC and you want them to be able to see their global responses and some specific responses, you want them to be able to, weave into more complex dialogue trees. This is one of the ways that you can do that. If you're doing something that's like a dialogue chain, so dialogue leading into dialogue, or dialogue that you need, okay, we need this dialogue to fire and then you need this next dialogue to fire, you're going to want to turn this off because you don't want these dialogue options to allow the player to break out of that dialogue. With the way that this dialogue is set up, dialogue 1, there's no way out of this dialogue. The player has to select this response because it's the only response available. Now, similar to that, we have goodbye responses, which are available when you select this checkbox here. The goodbye responses, you can edit here, and this is basically just like your generic get out of the dialogue option. And always available needs to be selected, because if that's not selected, when the player selects this option, it will go away forever. Now, these responses we can use similar to the global responses by using global responses on another dialogue. So now you can see, okay, now we have our by Amy option. You can also use global responses as well. So this dialogue now is going to have a dialogue response, a global response, and a goodbye response. Or we can just go ahead and disable those two. So the goodbye responses are nice generic goodbye responses basically that allow players to get out of the dialogue and get back to the game. So a good way to explain that would be, let's say you have a dialogue chain of 3 or 4 dialogues, you get to the end, you could have a couple specific responses and then maybe something that, okay, let's just get out of here, and exits the dialogue completely. Now the responses, we'll go ahead and move this back to currently selected dialogue responses. Now the responses are specific to, like I said, this dialogue here. For the tutorial story, I have all of them available on responses, but you could go ahead and play around with this and move them to global responses if you wanted to. So think of it as when you're playing House Party and you walk up to an NPC, this dialogue displays, responses is what the player can select at the bottom. And since this is 0, our default dialogue, this one's always going to fire when you first talk to an NPC, unless it's being overridden by a event. And then we have our big list of dialogues here, and then our global response, our goodbye responses at the bottom to just basically get out of this dialogue. Now let's go ahead and just pick this first one. There's no criteria on here, but this always available option is not selected. So what that means is when the player clicks this response, it's going to go away forever, and the player isn't going to be able to see it anymore. So we'll go ahead and say the player selects this option here, then it triggers a new dialogue, which you can select any of them here. Dialogue 1, it comes to this dialogue pops up for Amy, and then we have no alternate text, we have no, well, we have an emote here, but we have no other events, nothing on dialogue close, and one response at the bottom. So when the player selects this response, it'll close out this dialogue, and then the player won't be able to see this anymore. Same thing for these other ones. That's how you chain dialogue together. So for example, tell me a cool CSC trick I can use. This triggers dialogue 3. You come over here to dialogue 3, and then we have multiple responses. So let's come back to dialogue 1 here. Like I said, dialogue at the top, response at the bottom. You add new responses by clicking add new response. And you can add as many as you want. And these all have criteria on them. And they all have events that you can have triggered. They also have a trigger new dialogue option here, so you can just go ahead and lead into another dialogue option. So I'm going to go ahead and delete those responses I added. If we come to this one, you can see we have two responses here. One of them doesn't trigger a dialogue. This just basically closes out our dialogue chain. One of them down here triggers a new dialogue. So this is how you can make some branching dialogue. You could have a dialogue response here that leads to dialogue 5. This dialogue leads to dialogue 4, and then you can meet them back up at dialogue 6 or whatever you want to do. But we'll go ahead and keep that on no. Alright, let's go back to our dialogue 0 here. One thing to look at is criteria. So this one has a criteria that says dialogue Derek 5 was shown. Oops. Dialogue Derek. Oh, that's just like a little bug in the CSC. I'll take a look at that. But this is going to basically check to see, was that dialogue shown? And if it was, show this dialogue option, which in this case is I gave Derek the chicken nuggets, blah blah blah. This allows us to wrap up this opportunity and complete it. Now, if you go to the original story, you can see everything on dialogue 0 is a global response. That's just how we have it set up in the original story. These are all of the responses that you can give to Amy, and all of these have different criteria on them depending on what we want the player to see. So you can go ahead and click through these if you want to. It's good to get some inspiration for different ideas. You can see some of these are pretty complex depending on where the player is at in different storylines and dialogues and things like that. One good criteria to note is this met by player, because sometimes you want to have the player meet an NPC and then you don't want them to have a bunch of dialogue display that doesn't make sense for them to know yet. You can go ahead and hide that with met by player Amy true. This just checks to say, has the player met Amy before? Alright, so that is what our global responses / responses look like with your criteria. Now let me... Okay, perfect. This is a good example. So one thing that we do to control the way dialogue works with NPCs and with the player is we'll have criteria here that hides this dialogue, but then we'll also have, instead of triggering a new dialogue here, we'll have perform these events when this response is used. So in this case, we have 3 different dialogues down here that are going to fire based on different criteria. So this is how you can have one response, which is, in this case, truth or dare, and then 3 different dialogues fire depending on different criteria. And you can see each one of these connects to a different dialogue. 63, 62, 72. And I use this in a couple different places in the original story. I know for a fact with Ashley, yeah, I use it to say if Ashley likes the player enough, you can trigger her intimacy cutscene after finishing laying some pipe storyline. This triggers a new dialogue. But if the player doesn't have a high enough reputation, then it triggers a different dialogue that basically says, hey, your reputation isn't high enough with me to continue this story. I also have always available checked. So what this means is this dialogue option is going to be available so long as dialogue 340, which is this one right here, has not been shown. So that means the player will continuously be able to select this dialogue option until the player Ashley likes the player enough to trigger this dialogue and make this dialogue go away. So that's one way that you can set up a little bit of a loop here so the player can continuously ask this response and get feedback. Okay, why is this not continuing? She can tell them right here on this dialogue, this is what's happening. So, we'll go ahead and go back to our tutorial story here. And that pretty much covers everything that we need to know for dialogue. If you want to add a new dialogue, you can go ahead and click this little plus symbol here, and it will add it to the bottom of the list. Now there is not a way to remove dialogue with the CSC, so usually you can just keep adding on the end. And if you don't want to use it, you can just leave it blank. but now these dialogues, 7, 8, and 9, are going to be available anytime that I want to add something. So we can do new response, new dialogue response, trigger, and then we can go right into 7, and then we go right into dialogue 7, and you can do whatever you need to here. Add responses and things like that. Go ahead and collapse it. And that pretty much covers what our dialogue system looks like. Probably the last thing I'd like to point out for this is the dialogue filter up here. Depending on how crazy you get with all of your dialogue, you might need to search through your dialogue. So this is dialogue text and dialogue responses, which is pretty much what it sounds like. So let me give you an example. If you want to go, let's see. That searches through all of the dialogue text and pulls up all of the dialogue that includes this text. Alternatively, you can search responses. So in this case, there's only one, and this response shows up here. So that's how the search functionality at the top will work for dialogues. And that pretty much covers both dialogue and everything about character scripts. So this is really the bulk of where you're going to be spending your time once you have everything set up, and you can just go ahead and crank out dialogue, connect it together, and make those NPC characters come to life. Now, one thing that you might want to include in your custom story are the cutscenes that we have available in House Party. And you can go ahead and use those in your own custom story with your own characters and your own setups. So I'm going to show you how to do that real quick. We can go ahead and come into the tutorial story, and we're going to go to player event triggers, just so I can showcase how you might set something like this up. So I'm going to click insert here to add a new event trigger beneath the intimacy header, and we can just call this master bedroom intimacy. Now, to fire a cutscene, it's actually pretty simple. You just have to add a new event, and then on this list, go to cutscene, and then you have a couple options here, such as play scene, play random scene from location, current location, end scene, and end any scene with player. If you do play scene, you'll go ahead and select any cutscene that we have available in the original story, and then you'll select the characters that are going to be in that cutscene, and that's pretty much going to be it. It's that simple. So you could go Ashley Supporter for the Ashley Supporter cutscene. The first character is always going to need to be the player, because they are considered the star of the cutscene. And then you can go ahead and add an NPC character like, for example, Amy. And now when you call this event trigger, it's going to go ahead and fire this cutscene, which is the Ashley Supporter cutscene, with the player and Amy. And it's up to you, as the custom story creator, to make sure that all of these characters live in the right locations at the right time. So typically how I would set something like this up is I would have some kind of a dialogue, make sure that Amy is inside of the room that I want her to be, and then I would have the player talk to Amy, and then I might fire this event trigger from a dialogue. So for example, you could just come to Amy, dialogue. I'm going to go ahead and ignore all of this right here, but you can just pretend we have a dialogue where Amy says, "Yep, I'm ready for a cutscene." And then you would just do on dialogue close, event triggers, select which character had that event trigger, which in this case it's the player, perform event, master bedroom intimacy. And that's it. It's, like I said, it's up to you to make sure that these characters are in the correct location, and to make sure that everything logically makes sense. But technically, you could have Amy and the player in the living room, and then just fire this cutscene from anywhere. And once that cutscene completes, some of the cutscenes are going to position those characters within that room. So for example, let me come back to our cutscene event right here. For example, I guess we could do Ashley Supporter, that's fine. So this we know takes place inside of Madison's bathroom. So once this cutscene finishes playing, it's going to have the player and Amy warp to the master bedroom bathroom. If you wanted to do something different with the after cutscene effects, all you need to do is create a new event trigger. And then I'm just going to go ahead and change that title. You can name this whatever you want, but I would typically do something like this, add a hyphen and say after cutscene. Then if you go to when, you can select from this list when you want this event trigger to fire, and all the way at the bottom you can have something that says on after cutscene ends. Select this and then select which cutscene you want. We will go Ashley Supporter because the Ashley Supporter cutscene is the one we're using for this example. And then you can add events here to do whatever you want to do with your characters. So you could warp Amy to the garage, and we'll put the player there with her. You could do anything like, let's say clothing, Amy, all off, and anything else that you really want to do to handle your after cutscene handling, I should say. And you can do that for any of the cutscenes that are in the game. One thing to keep in mind is this event trigger right here that I just created does not have any criteria on it. So that means every time this cutscene fires, whether you fire it from the console, or you're firing it here from this event trigger, or maybe you have another event trigger, and this one's like an Ashley variant, assuming you have like an Ashley character in your game. Now it doesn't matter which one of these you call, they're going to fire this after cutscene ends event, because this cutscene finishes, it's going to go ahead and check for this event, and then fire these events. So you could control this a couple different ways. One way that I would typically handle this in like the original story is I would have some kind of a value, so I would know which character the player is currently engaged in intimacy with, and also which storyline the player has going on, because sometimes they might be repeating a cutscene, or sometimes you might be doing a very specific storyline that you need to handle in a certain way. So in this instance, let's say we would have Amy, and we'll just go ahead and add a value for her that says intimacy with player. Then we could come over here, we'll go modify value, Amy, intimacy with player equals 1. Then we can come down here to our event trigger that handles the after cutscene, and then add a criteria to check that value. And then what I would probably do is at the end of this event trigger, modify the value and set that to 0. You could get a lot more in-depth and complicated with this, but this will demonstrate what we're trying to see here, which is that if we call this event trigger here, it's going to modify this value, fire this cutscene with the player and Amy, and then after this cutscene ends, it's going to check this event trigger, check this criteria, and then fire these events. If we call the Ashley variant of the Ashley Supporter cutscene event trigger, it's going to come down here and check for on after cutscene ends, and it's going to bypass this because the criteria does not pass. And so you can go ahead and add another event trigger here. Actually, you can just go ahead and copy and paste. Call this Ashley variant. And then same thing, we could have an Ashley value here, We could have different events that fire specifically for Ashley, and so this could allow you to use these cutscenes in a multitude of different ways with different characters and have the handling for them all be different. One example is in the original story, we reuse a lot of our cutscenes like in the master bedroom, or I'm trying to think, we have like the Ashley cutscene in her bedroom, things like that. And usually what we do after an intimacy cutscene is we would fire some kind of a dialogue just to kind of have the NPC interact with the player after the cutscene finishes. And if you set it up this way with these after cutscene events, then you can go ahead and make sure that you're firing the correct dialogue for the correct character that the player is with in your story. And that pretty much covers everything you need to know about the cutscenes. One thing to note, if it has an _C, that's going to be the clean version of that cutscene. And then if you have one that's like this, where it has an F, that's going to be for a female player. So this F, Ashley finale, is assuming that the player is going to be female in that cutscene. So this is basically like a girl-girl cutscene. If you have the Ashley finale up here, this one's going to assume that the player is going to be male, and the cutscene is going to look like the player character is male. And one thing to keep in mind for that, copy, paste, is, let's say you have an Ashley finale with the player, you can go ahead and go for a female Ashley finale, and then just check the player criteria here. So add criteria underneath this event. And now, whenever you call this event trigger here, it'll check for is the player gender male, then fire the male version of that cutscene. And if the player gender is female, fire the female version. And then you'll also need handling for each of those variants as well. And that about covers the cutscene intimacy. We also have the POV intimacy options available, and for those I would recommend digging into the original story, or you can kind of do some experimenting on your own. So we'll go add here. You can see we have the intimacy option, and intimacy here is going to be all of your POV options. So we'll have, for example, player, act, any kind of a position that you want, and then the character that they're going to be acting that out with. And the order of characters here is going to matter. So go ahead and experiment with that in your own custom stories, and see what kind of shenanigans you can get into. Now, we're going to go ahead and take a look at how to playtest your story, which we can do that by exporting your story and then loading it up in House Party so you can play through it. Now to do that, you're going to have to go to your story collection script, and down here you'll see Import Story and Export Story. So if you go ahead and click on Export Story, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to navigate over to your Documents folder, and this is the default location for the custom stories. You should see Eek, House Party, Mods, and then Stories. So what we're looking for is your Documents folder, Eek, House Party, Mods, Stories. And this is the default location if you have House Party installed on your computer to play through. Now in this folder right here is where we're going to put your custom story that you made so you can play through it. So right click and go ahead and make a new folder. And whatever you name this folder here needs to match whatever your story name is up here. So in this case we have our tutorial story. And if you don't do this correctly and you name this something else, then you're going to get an error message when you try and load it in House Party. But double click that folder and then go ahead and click Select Folder. And what that's going to do is it's going to export your story to that folder. Now if for some reason you want to import your story, so like for example you're making some changes over here with your characters or an event trigger and you don't like how things are working out, then you can import story and it's going to have a story file right here. And this will load everything for your story that you had previously exported. And this is also a good way that you can also save and load your story if you want to playtest different ideas or, try different avenues, things like that. So once you have your story exported, which you can go ahead and export it as many times as you'd like into this folder, you'll need to go ahead and boot up House Party, and then I will show you how to get into the game. Once you have House Party booted up and you come to the main menu, over here on the left where it says which story would you like to play, go ahead and select the story that you made, which in our case we have the tutorial story. And right now, if this is not named the same thing as your story file, you'll get an error message that pops up. But since we did this correctly, we should be good to go. Just click on New Game. And then you can see that we have our option of male or female player because we have those checkboxes checked. Click Confirm, and then you should be in your custom story. Now, for this story that I loaded up, this is the tutorial story. So you can go ahead and see this is the text box that we set up at the very beginning of the tutorial video. And you can see everything that we have set up here with Amy and Derek, the doors, everything is set up. We removed the garage door so you can't interact with it. Slider door, you can open that. And this is what your custom story is going to look like. Alright, that about covers everything in this tutorial video for the Custom Story Creator 1.4.2. We covered how to create your own custom stories from scratch, how to add the characters that you want to add, how to select the items that you want to select to be available in the story. We went over event triggers and cutscenes. We showcased how to export your story so you can playtest it in House Party. And then once you have a custom story put together that you're happy with and you want to share, you can do that through the main menu of the House Party game. If you run into any other issues, or you have any questions, or you just want to showcase the work that you created, you can join our Discord for Eek Games, and we have a channel there called the Custom Stories Channel. And I would encourage you to head there if you have any questions or you need anything explained, because that's where the custom story creators tend to congregate. One last thing that I would note is I would recommend, once you get all the basics down with how the custom story creator works, is I would go into an event trigger, go into the criteria and the events, and just go through those drop-down menus and really explore all of the different options that you have. Because the way that the custom story creator works is that nothing really happens in the game unless you put it in the custom story creator for it to happen. So characters aren't going to react, characters aren't going to fight, characters aren't going to talk unless you give them the ability to do that. So you can make this as free-form sandbox as you want, or you can make a more narrowly focused custom story that kind of has the player on rails as they go through it. Whatever you want to create is entirely up to you, and I'm excited to see it. Thank you for watching.